because we live in a scary world. It's always been true, but I think we're maybe more attuned to it now than we have been in recent years. And as we were praying earlier, one of the things perhaps that frightens us about the world is our inability to control the world. Unpredictable things keep happening. There are storms, if I can put it like this, that arise in our world. We can think, of course, of COVID not that long ago. We can think of the war in Ukraine. We can think of inflation and the cost of living. All of these different storms have arisen just in the last few years. Of course, in Jesus' day, the storms would have been different, but storms nonetheless. What about the next harvest and how successful that may or may not be? What about the Romans and what they might do next? Those are the big storms. The storms that get reported on the news, the storms that everybody experiences to a certain extent. But in life there are also very localized storms. The storm that we've read about here in Mark chapter 4 was a localized storm. It was just on the Lake of Galilee. We don't read or hear very much about its effects elsewhere, and storms in that part of the world tend to be like that, very local. You'll have localized storms in your own life. A car accident, a doctor's appointment, a relationship breakdown, a redundancy. And suddenly, out of nowhere, we're in a storm. Now, the storm that we read about in Mark chapter 4 was a real storm. Wind, waves, maybe some rain. It happened just like the Bible said it did. But when we read this story of the storm on the lake, we realize and understand that there's a deeper significance here than merely telling us about the weather conditions over Galilee 2,000 years ago. The way that Jesus and his disciples behaved in the storm is supposed to teach us something, isn't it? Teach us something about the storms, the metaphorical storms in our own lives, and how we should handle those and think about those. There's so much to learn, therefore, about the storms in our own lives. And I want to start with a very simple observation. Something that's so simple, it's easy to miss. But we mustn't miss it. It's of vital importance if we're to understand how we should respond in storms and the place that storms have in our own lives. Here it is. The disciples' obedience does not stop the storm from coming. Can you see that from the passage? You see, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that storms come when we're being disobedient to God's will. Now, it's certainly true that can be the case. Pete said, it's okay for me to ask you questions. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but don't expect anyone to answer them. That's not quite what he said, but it was something along those lines. But I'm a visitor and you've got to be nice to me, so you've got to answer my questions. So can you think of an example in the Bible where a storm came on someone because they were disobedient? Anyone think of one? Jonah, fantastic. And not just because you've heard this sermon before. Jonah, he experienced the storm because he was disobedient. But that's not the case here, is it? What happens in this case is the very opposite. Look at verse 35. It's Jesus who says, let's go across to the other side. So these disciples are not disobedient. They're not disobedient. They're doing exactly as Jesus asked. And doing what Jesus asks caused them to experience the storm. So, let me speak to anyone here tonight who is perhaps going through a storm right now. Or maybe you're still bruised from the effects of a storm that has recently battered you. That storm does not mean that you are outside of God's will. The fact that you endured the storm does not necessarily mean that you did anything wrong. Now, it could be, as it was for Jonah, but even when the storm hit Jonah, there were a dozen other men, at least on that boat, who were not running away from God. But they were still in the storm. So this is the first thing that I want you to remember. Storms can hit even when we do exactly what God asks us to do. The second thing that I want you to notice from this passage is just as obvious, just as simple. Jesus doesn't stop the storm from coming. Now, You know the ending to the story. If you didn't, we read it together, and you saw what happened. The story ends with Jesus calming the storm. That's what happens in the end. But a lot goes on before that point, doesn't it? And Jesus' miraculous calming of the storm is a sign of tremendous power. But, maybe you've thought this yourself, if Jesus had all that power to stop the storm in the end, surely he had the power to stop the storm in the first place. For example, Jesus could have known about the storm in advance. If he'd have known about the storm in advance, he could have suggested the disciples delay their crossing. He could have suggested they took the long way round via land instead of across the lake. But Jesus didn't do that. He allowed them to sail into the oncoming storm. And even if Jesus didn't do that, he could still, once the kind of early stirrings of the storm came, he could have nipped it in the bud. He could have calmed the storm before it got too alarming. But Jesus didn't do that. He allowed the storm to reach a tempest. And even if Jesus didn't do any of those things, he could still have, as soon as the storm starts to get really dangerous, he could have, rather than sleeping through it, he could have comforted his disciples. He could have helped to bail out the boat. He could have calmed the storm before they really started to panic. But Jesus didn't do that either. He allowed his disciples to think that they were being overwhelmed. So just to recap, Jesus allowed them to sail into the oncoming storm. He allowed the storm to reach a tempest. He allowed the disciples to think they'd be overwhelmed. And that's what leads the disciples to the question they ask in verse 38, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And the question makes sense, doesn't it? Here is Jesus, their friend and master, and as far as they can see, he is doing absolutely nothing to help them in their moment of terror and danger. Don't you care? Is a reasonable question. And the unspoken question is reasonable too. Why aren't you doing anything to help? And maybe you've asked those questions of Jesus yourself. Perhaps you've been in the midst of a storm. Perhaps you're in the midst of a storm right now. And it seems to you as though Jesus has done nothing to help. He's allowed you to sail unsuspectingly into the oncoming storm. He's allowed the storm in your life to reach a tempest. He's allowed you to think that you'll be overwhelmed. And part of me wishes I could say to you, don't worry, Jesus would never do that. He'd never allow you to sail unsuspectingly into the storm. Never allow a storm to reach a tempest in your life. Never allow you to feel overwhelmed. But I can't promise you that Jesus would never do that, because sometimes he does do that. So we're left with the same question that the disciples ask. Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? Now, the interesting thing about Jesus' response is that he doesn't speak to them in response, does he? He speaks to the wind and the waves. And when he does speak to his disciples, you can see it in verse 40, he says, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" In other words, while to the disciples it looks as though the storm means that Jesus doesn't care, Jesus is saying, that's not the problem. The problem is not that I don't care. The problem is your fear through a lack of faith. We'll come, as we go through this message, to understand more about what Jesus is saying there. But for now, the simple point is that Jesus is saying, look, you should know better. I do allow people I love to go through storms. I can love you and still let you go through a storm. And I hope that's clear from this story. That Jesus loved his disciples, that he cared deeply for them. And yet he didn't stop the storm from coming. We can see it in this story. We don't read this story and think, Jesus didn't care about his disciples. We don't think that, do we? But when a storm hits our life, maybe we find it harder then. Maybe when the storm hits our life, we do draw that line between the storm and Jesus' lack of care for us. We don't do it here, but we do it in our own lives sometimes. And maybe we need to hear that Jesus does allow people he loves to go through storms. And he can love you and still let you go through a storm. And we've got to understand that. Just as being in a storm doesn't mean that we've been disobedient, being in a storm doesn't mean that Jesus has forgotten us or doesn't love us. And deep down, I think we know that, don't we? Because we can see what Jesus has done. We can see his faithfulness to us, despite our waywardness, despite our fecklessness. We can look to the cross and we see his love poured out as he suffered in our place. So whatever storm you have experienced or are experiencing, don't think for a moment that it means that Jesus doesn't care. He does care more than you can even imagine. And that leads us to the third thing that I want you to notice from this passage this evening. And for this point, I'm going to exaggerate to make the point. And I think you'll understand what I mean. I'm exaggerating to make the point. But here's what I want you to notice. I want you to notice that Jesus had more trouble calming the disciples than he did in calming the storm. Can you see that? Jesus had more trouble calming the disciples than he did calming the storm. So look carefully, verse 38. The disciples are in a bit of a panic. Now at this point in verse 38, the waves are breaking in the boat. The boat is already filling. And the disciples are panicking. Don't you care that we are perishing, they say. Now it's interesting, it doesn't come out in all English translations. The ESV does a good job here of translating this. They don't say, do you not care that we're going to perish? They don't say that. They actually say, do you not care that we are perishing? Right now we're already dying, the disciples are concerned. And it's fair to say that in verse 38, the disciples, like the sea, are not calm. They're in a panic. And we understand that. We can sympathize with that. Now, by the end of the next verse, that's verse 39, the wind has ceased. There was a great calm. And I hope you can see the irony of verse 39 and verse 40. There was a great calm. In verse 41, you could paraphrase, and there was still a great panic. The sea is calm. The disciples are not calm. And we know that because verse 40 says, these tenses are so important. You guys who are doing English or Welsh in school, maybe you get to grammar and you think, well, I'm going to skip, this is the boring stuff. It's not the boring stuff. It's the really interesting stuff. Grammar really matters when we're looking at the scripture. Just as we said earlier, it doesn't say, do you not care that we will perish? It says that we are perishing. It gives us a real sense of how desperately they feel. We're dying here, Jesus. When we get to verse 40, the tenses are important again, really important. Jesus doesn't say, why were you so afraid, does he? It's not what he says, verse 40. What does he say? Why are you so afraid? Why are you so afraid? This lake is still. The wind is gone. You're not perishing, but you're still afraid. Why is that so? And just in case we've missed that tense in verse 40, we can see in verse 41, makes it really clear to us, and they were filled with great fear. No more storm, completely safe. They're terrified still. And that's why I'm suggesting that Jesus had more trouble calming the disciples than he did calming the storm. So why were the disciples so afraid? Well, they were afraid, I think, because they realized that Jesus had absolute power. Jesus had just got up and told off the wind and the waves as if they were a naughty child, and they'd obeyed straight away. Many of you have experience of trying to get naughty children to behave. And you don't always succeed. So we who can't even get a naughty child to calm down, look on the one who can rebuke the wind and the waves and get them to calm down. And you don't know anyone with that power. I don't know who your friends are. But even if you were best mates with Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, and Elon Musk, you still don't know anyone who can do that. In World War II, D-Day was scheduled for the 5th of June, 1944. 23 entire divisions of infantry were armed and ready. There were nearly 4,500 bombers and 4,000 fighter aircraft that were ready to support the invasion. Nearly 7,000 ships and landing crafts were prepared. 200,000 vehicles were ready to set sail. There were more than 3 million troops in the UK ready to follow them in. Eisenhower, Montgomery had given the go-ahead. Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, all in support. It was the greatest firepower ever amassed, either before or since. Everyone was ready to go. But they didn't go. Because D-Day did not take place on the 5th of June, 1944. So what turned back all those troops? Well, it wasn't the 40,000 German troops waiting on the beaches that turned them back. It wasn't the 15,000 bunkers and the 3,000 heavy guns on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It wasn't that stopped the invasion. What stopped the invasion was a storm in the English Channel. And the great army, the greatest ever assembled, with its powerful generals and its supreme commander, could not stop the storm. They had to wait it out. And here is Jesus all alone, with no magic words or special tricks, and he just tells the storm to stop. And it stops. And what the might of the combined British, Canadian, and US armies could not do, Jesus did with just 2 words. And so the disciples are filled with great fear. Imagine being a German soldier on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944. And you wake up and you look out your bunker and you see on the horizon tens of thousands of ships and landing crafts, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they're all coming for you. How do you feel? Terrified. And the disciples looked at Jesus and saw greater power than that. They were terrified too, because they had to reckon with this other question. You can see it in verse 41. Who then is this? And maybe the disciples knew about Psalm 65, verse 5. By awesome deeds you answer us with righteousness, O God of our salvation, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, the one who by his strength established the mountains, being girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, the tumult of their peoples. Maybe they knew about Psalm 89, verses 8 and 9. O Lord God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, with your faithfulness all around you. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Maybe they knew about Psalm 107, verses 28 and 29. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. And the disciples were terrified, because they were beginning to realize that their friend Jesus was Almighty God himself. And Jesus had more trouble calming the disciples than he did calming the storm, because the disciples were just as afraid of Jesus' greater power than they were of the storm's lesser power. Jesus rebuked the storm, but he rebuked the disciples too, didn't he? Verse 40. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And Jesus is saying, you're wrong to be afraid of me. He doesn't tell them that they're wrong to be afraid of the storm, But he does tell them they're wrong to be afraid of him. They don't need to be afraid. Jesus never left them. Jesus had more power than the storm. But crucially, critically, Jesus, he used that power for their good. He used that power for their good. You see, they've seen his power up until this point. They know this is true. They've heard the voice from heaven declaring Jesus to be the Son of God. They've seen Jesus' power over unclean spirits. They've seen his power over every imaginable illness. They've seen his authority in teaching and preaching. Now they've seen his authority and power over the storm. And if only they'd realized, we've only ever seen Jesus using his power for the good of others. That's what they've missed. It is frightening to be faced with a great power. It is frightening. Imagine you were in Ukraine and you saw tanks rolling down the street past your window. How would you feel? Well, perhaps it might depend on whose tanks they were, mightn't it? The tanks of a friend or the tanks of an enemy? It makes all the difference. And that's what the disciples seem to have forgotten. Great power, when it's on your side, is a wonderful, glorious thing. And when Jesus stilled the storm, they understood perhaps that he was more powerful than they thought was possible. But maybe they'd forgotten that he was using that power for their good. I wonder if we sometimes make the same mistake and forget that when we're in the storm, Jesus does indeed work out all things for the good of those who love him. And surely we can see it. We don't just hear the voice of heaven declaring Jesus to be God's Son. We haven't just seen his power over unclean spirits and over those illnesses. We haven't just heard about his authority in preaching and teaching. We know now his power over the storm. More importantly than that, we know his power over sin and death. And we can look through our Bibles and on page after page after page, as we see his power, what do we also see? Him using his power for our good and for the good of those who love him. That's what the disciples failed to believe. That's what we must hold on to. And that leads us to the final thing that I want to share with you from this passage this morning. That our biggest mistake is not that we're afraid in the storm, but that we're afraid after the storm has been stilled. This was the mistake that the disciples made. It's the same mistake that we make today. Our biggest mistake is not that we're afraid in the storm, but that we're afraid after the storm has been stilled. And to help you to see this, I want to take you to another part of the Bible. An earlier story that is echoed in this story. Because there's another story in the Bible of a different person who was asleep in a storm, and another storm that was stilled. Can anyone think of the other story in the Bible about a man who was sleeping on a boat in a storm that got stilled? It's the same answer we had earlier. Jonah. Jonah, we get fixated on the fish. We forget the events on board. If you want to, you can put your finger in Jonah chapter 1 and look these things up as we talk about them, or you can check them out later. But there's many echoes in the book of Jonah that there is in the calming of this storm. And I don't think those things are a coincidence. First and most obviously, both Jesus and Jonah are out at sea on a boat. Well, you might think that's not much of a parallel. Well, maybe not on its own. But both Jesus and Jonah's boats are overwhelmed by a storm. A great wind in Jonah chapter 1. A great windstorm in Mark chapter 4. Less obviously, there is that third similarity we've spoken of. that just like Jesus, Jonah was asleep in the storm. Do you remember? And there's a fourth similarity too, that in both cases, their fellow sailors come to wake up the sleeper and ask the sleeper to do something about the storm because we're all about to perish. It's in both stories. So in both stories, they're out at sea on a boat. They're both in a storm in a boat. They're both asleep in the storm in the boat. And they're both wakened by fellow sailors who tell them they're about to perish and ask them to do something. But that's not all. In both stories, there's a miraculous calming of the sea. And sixthly, in both stories, the last thing we read about the fellow sailors is what? That they're more afraid by the calming of the sea than they were of the storm itself. It's in both stories. Do you think that's a coincidence? Because I don't. I think the way that Mark wrote this story was deliberately designed to echo that earlier story of Jonah. Except, maybe you might be saying, well, hang on a minute, Mark. There might be 6 similarities between these stories, but there's also an important difference too. And you'd be right to point that difference out because it really matters. Because in the story of Jonah and the storm, Jonah doesn't still the storm and save the sailors with just a word, does he? It's not how it works. What does Jonah do? If I can put it like this, Jonah takes their place. He suffers the consequences of the storm on their behalf. They were all about to go into the depths of the ocean. But Jonah tells them, throw me overboard. I'll suffer the consequences of the storm. Then the sea will become calm. And that's not what happened with Jesus. In this storm, Jesus spoke. But of course, this storm is not the only storm that Jesus faced here on earth. It might not be how Jesus stilled this storm, but if I can put it like this, what happened to Jonah did happen to Jesus. Because in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus tells the Pharisees that just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus stilled this storm on Galilee with just a couple of words. But Jesus didn't come to earth just to keep a few disciples safe as they crossed the lake. It's not why he came. He had a much bigger mission than that. He came not to still this storm, but to still all storms. He came to still the storm of brokenness. He came to still the storm of destruction. He came to still the storm of disease. He came to still the storm of death. He came to still the storm of sin and its consequences. And those storms could not be stilled with just a word. Those storms could only be stilled in the way that Jonah's storm was stilled. Those storms could only be stilled by Jesus taking on the consequences of the storm himself in our place. And he did that by dying for us at the cross. And having done so, spending those 3 days in the heart of the earth as Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the great fish. You see, there are storms. We might call them little storms. They don't feel like little storms, just as this one didn't feel like a little storm to the disciples. But these localized storms, these storms that we go through, Jesus endures those storms with us. He's with us in the boat. You've heard sermons like that. You've maybe taught lessons like that in Sunday school. They're good sermons. They're good lessons. Jesus is with us in the boat. And he is. But that ultimate storm of death, Jesus is not with you in the boat. Because he's in the storm. And that ultimate storm of death and sin and its consequences, Jesus doesn't endure with you. He endures instead of you. As he takes our punishment on the cross. You see, the biggest mistake that you and I make is not that we're afraid in the storm, but that we're afraid after the storm has been stilled. And I'm here this evening to remind you of what you already know, that Jesus has calmed the storm. Not just the little storm in the lake in Galilee, But Jesus has calmed that great storm of the wrath of God breaking on us for the wrong things that we have done. He has taken our hell on himself in our place as he suffered on the cross. And that storm of God's wrath and the anger that we deserve, that storm has been stilled. And we do not need to be afraid after the storm has been stilled. You see, do you remember these disciples were afraid because they realized the power of Jesus, but had forgotten that he always used his power for their good. We've got an advantage over those disciples, have we not? As we can look back at Calvary and see Jesus' power even over death itself, over the consequences of sin. And we can see what the disciples fail to see here, that Jesus always exercises his amazing, incredible, great power for our good. And that's why when our faith is in Jesus Christ, we need not fear any storm. Because we know the one who rules the universe loves us and has already calmed the storm. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you